Hi everyone, my name is Forrest and welcome to today's module of System Hardening for Beginners. Before we get into today's module, which is going to be based around disk encryption and how you can use it, we're going to quickly recap based on what we've already talked about in this series. So in the beginning of this series, we went ahead and introduced a lot of these ideas behind what system hardening is, what it might not be, and beyond that, well, a little bit of sprinkles of various technology. In the second module, we went ahead and leveraged PowerShell as well as the graphical user interface to go ahead and figure out how we can go ahead and create as well as disable, enable, and delete any user accounts on a computer. And previous video to this, we went ahead and evaluated a bit of the out-of-the-box security solutions for both Mac OS and Windows OS. We predominantly went ahead and evaluated based on Windows OS, but we did cover, in theory, the ideas of Mac OS. So let's go ahead and dive right into the ideas behind, well, the disk encryption capabilities that we have here. So again, today we're going to be talking about disk encryption. If you don't know what that is, that's perfectly okay because we're going to go ahead and cover it. So what exactly is disk encryption? Well, very straightforward. It's exactly how it sounds. It's encrypting a disk. Now, if you're not too sure about what that means and what encryption means, right? If you ever were part of a cereal box rewards or games or anything like that, you probably had to decode something, right? As a kid, most of us probably had done some form of spy thing, right? And a random string of characters actually needed to be decoded with a cool decoder ring or something to go ahead and tell us exactly what the message actually means. And encryption is pretty similar to that. As well, encryption, it gives you that added layer of security, and it can result in serious trouble if not set up well. So overall, with this disk encryption, it's the idea of converting these pieces of information into essentially gibberish, right? If you don't have that key. Again, thinking back to that decoder ring as a really cool cipher, right? So in other words, think of a lock that is extremely difficult to pick. Disk encryption, it's not infallible, but it provides an immense challenge to any would-be bad actor. In computer systems, we tend to go ahead and use disk encryption to protect the data on our computer systems, right? This is so that way if a device is ever stolen, if it's compromised from a remote access, anything else like that, that we still have the data that we need, right? And there are generally a few options for encryption. There's a ton of vendors that go ahead and offer these. As well, there are capabilities for Microsoft and Mac OS right out of the box. For the scope of this module, though, we're going to be really talking about full disk encryption and use space encryption, two features that are really offered by BitLocker there. Now, there's, again, many reasons to have disk encryption applied really all throughout your environment. That can be for your personal computer, that can be an enterprise environment, whatever it may be. And although disk encryption is mainly used in enterprises, as this tends to be a turn-on feature as opposed to something that is out of the box, it can still be used by standard and personal users, right? As consumers, we can go ahead and use disk encryption for our personal computers here. And there are good use cases for it. Again, think of those stolen laptops, right? You're traveling, you're maybe surfing the web, doing, videos like this, whatever else it may be with your laptop. And unfortunately, you leave it behind because you step to the restroom or maybe you're not looking and somebody quickly snags it, whatever it may be. If you don't have disk encryption enabled, well, if a bad actor goes ahead and just uses some level of technology to go ahead and start reading what's on the disk, well, it's game over. They don't even need your credentials at that point. Disk encryption, though, it provides that extra layer between that. That forces that bad actor to really figure out how they're going to conduct an attack like this. Now, one thing I do want to mention, just because the laptop is stolen, even if you have disk encryption, right, it doesn't magically mean your data is entirely safe. If you don't have any user passwords or anything like that on your machine, well, your data still isn't safe after all. that tends to be something that you, again, have to use complementary solutions, and there is no infallible solution behind that, right? However, that's, again, that layer of defense in depth, right? Disk encryption is another layer of defense. One important thing to call out, though, is that if it's improperly managed, right? You set up disk encryption, you don't go ahead and print off the recovery key, or you don't, store it somewhere, be it on your OneDrive or anything else like that, and then you forget it, and you need to access the disk. Well, you're kind of out of luck because you applied disk encryption that you no longer have the recovery capabilities on. So again, it's important on this feature. You have to be very diligent and very conscious of how you're doing it. A potential idea, in my opinion, is to have the recovery key, whenever you apply disk encryption, stored in a software such as OneDrive. In OneDrive, you can have this thing called a vault, which essentially is only accessible by your Microsoft account, and also you have to have an additional password or authentication method to be able to access this vault beyond just accessing your account. That way you can always access this recovery key if it's needed. An additional idea, and some people might scream their head off by me saying this, printing off that key code and storing it in like a physical lockbox, a safe, anything else like that at home in case it was ever needed. Right? You don't want to put it on your fridge like it's a kid's drawing or something like that, to where you show it off to every guest saying, "This is my disk encryption recovery key." But you want to go ahead and still have that accessible for you in case you need to in a secured method. The main idea behind it all, you always want to be able to access this key if need be. One other key point, disk encryption leverages these things we call cryptographic keys. The idea of what cryptographic keys are is far beyond the scope of what we're going to be talking on in these modules, and especially from a beginner level idea. However, if you're really into math, I'd recommend start learning about cryptography, right? Look into key exchanges in computers. These can be entire career paths, by the way. So if you're really into math and, doing super cool spy stuff sounds cool to you, look into cryptography. It might be a really good career. So we did talk about we're going to be covering two different scopes here. Full disk encryption versus use-based encryption. So in this, let's before we even go into the comparison, let's talk about the factor of, well, why would you only want to, or why is there a specific call out being made to these two functions, right? And as we talked about, we'll be leveraging Windows operating system. And as such, we're going to dominantly speak about BitLocker, their encryption functionality here. These two different functions, full disk encryption and use space only encryption, are two different capabilities that BitLocker goes ahead and offers. So, just very high level, full disk encryption, it's generally that go-to for most of the use cases, right? It gets the job done. Most enterprise people go to full disk encryption because it's just easy to set up right from the get-go, and it can get the computer going. It's generally offered in most in most encryption solutions, so not just only BitLocker, but things like File Vault or any other disk encryption software that we'll be talking about. And it doesn't necessarily care if the file was made 10 years ago or anything else like that. It'll encrypt it as long as it's on the disk. Now, most organizations, they actually choose to go with this full disk encryption method, right? The main reason behind that, well, it tends to be comprehensive. And it's something they don't have to go ahead and think of various use cases, anything else on. It's easy, it's very minimal to administrate, and it's very, very, very comprehensive. However, let's talk about use space only encryption. So this is one of the newer models that's offered in BitLocker. And it's really a great alternative for whenever situations may have changed, or maybe your computer did not previously have as much of like the sensitive information, right? You don't want to bloat up your encryption, just like anything else, right? You don't want to just overload it with information that it doesn't frankly need. But generally, it's more of a niche use case after all. I mean, again, it's not this full disk encryption. This is something that is that very specific use case of Joe in accounting wants to go ahead and have a new volume drive. We're going to use the use space only on it because it's brand new, whatever. Again, if this was a brand new computer, generally, it wouldn't matter though, right? If it's brand new, there's not data sitting there. Very same with the volume. If it's a brand new volume, it wouldn't matter if it was sitting there. You know why? Because there's nothing there. So full disk encryption is going to still cover the full disk, and guess what? The U space encryption, that's still going to cover everything because there's almost nothing that wasn't in the U space. So again, various niche use cases, right? And it applies going forward as well, so it's only really that data that's currently used now or is written in the future, so anything that's not like archived or from the past and not used won't be really covered on it. And generally speaking, IT teams like it because it decreases that amount of deployment time and new volumes and everything else like that. One key thing, if you're a security nerd or maybe a compliance nerd, right? Most of these compliance frameworks that are common throughout the industry, they don't differentiate between full disk encryption or use space encryption. They tend to just say you need to have your disk encrypted. Doesn't necessarily say how, doesn't necessarily specify that it needs to be one or the other. These compliance frameworks tend to be something similar of HIPAA or PCI, maybe SOX, SOX if you're familiar with that, so on and so forth. Now, we did say we're going to talk about a little bit of the disk encryption software here. So we did pull up a few different examples of, well, disk encryption software. In this, we do have two main ones we're going to be talking about. BitLocker, which is free with Windows Pro, and as well FileVault, which is on Mac OS. BitLocker, though, again, I want to really emphasize, it's not free on every single Windows license, right? Remember, Windows offers different licenses, they offer different functionalities by those licenses, so on and so forth. One of the selling points of why somebody would want to buy a Pro license is because they get BitLocker with it. Now, those two aside, multiple companies have made a career basically off of selling disk encryption software. You know, we can see Axcrypt, TrueCrypt, Discryptor. Say those all 3 times fast, right? But they've all made careers off of selling these disk encryption softwares. But the main importance is that you do your research based on what you are looking for and what you feel is appropriate for your needs. So before we go ahead and go off of this, just to really emphasize the point, let's go over to the browser and let's cover these other categories, right? So as you can see on this page, we're going to just zoom in a little bit here. But you can see there are a ton of still maintained disk encryption softwares here. We're going to go ahead and just filter by the ones that are not maintained. So we can see what there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, about under 25 or so. And we can see for the remainder of this list that there still are an immense amount of disk encryption software. As well, we can see in the operating system, you know, what operating system is compatible, right? So let's just say we had a very niche use case. Let's go with OpenBSD. That's very straightforward and easy. We're going to sort by yes instead. So, okay, well, if we are running only OpenBSD, well, guess what? Now we have to go ahead and specifically look for the disk encryption software that supports this, right? We're not going to go into the acronyms or anything else like that. You know, again, these are things that you can research, but they're beyond the scope of this course. But definitely, main thing, research as much as possible. Let's go ahead and return to the slideshow here. All right, so let's start talking about FileVault, Mac OS, right? You saw this in the previous module here where we talked about that security settings page that Mac OS offers. Now, what Mac OS goes ahead and does is it has an encryption capability called FileVault. This has been an asset on any Mac OS device since 2003, whenever they launched their 10.3 Panther operating system. But, like everything, there were limitations, right? This was only able to be applied to users' home directory at that point in time. again, remember, this idea of secure boot, shift left, look at the hardware, look at anything else like that, it's relatively new. At this time, whenever FileVault was released, this was groundbreaking that it was able to even go ahead and encrypt the user home directory. So always just keep that in mind. I mean, it sounds silly whenever it comes down to it of, oh, it only did that, but this was groundbreaking for 2003. Now, whenever we say on-the-fly encryption, we're really talking about this real-time encryption, basically saying that the data is automatically encrypted as it's saved. So if you're downloading and writing a new Word document, anything else like that, assuming you're in 2003 and you have FileVault enabled, well, as it's saved, as that document is saved, guess what? It gets encrypted. That basically ensures that no data that's stored on an encrypted volume, that disk, right, can be read without the right keys. And this is very similar to how use space only is with any of its ongoing encryption. And as could be imagined, right, the FileVault encryption is best tied to the Apple ID. On Windows, we talk about Microsoft IDs, but Apple is just as guilty of trying to push using their ecosystem as possible, right? FileVault is best tied to that user's Apple ID, and they go ahead and can access the iCloud, basically Apple's cloud. That way it has the backup, and it's very similar to having your recovery key from BitLocker stored into OneDrive there. And this is something that Apple advocates for, by the way. Again, both vendors trying to push you to use their ecosystem, and no, neither is really wrong on that. They try to take a lot of the security and a lot of the concerns off of your hands. Now, a good call out though, if someone has this Apple T2 security chip, a hardware component essentially, or a iMac Pro, the data on the drive is automatically encrypted, but they still recommend turning on FileVault, right? So you still have, out of the box, your data on the drive is being encrypted, but Apple still does recommend turning on FileVault. That said, there are limitations. As you can see on that last bullet point, it can't be used with RAID disk sets. If you're not technical, or if maybe you just haven't been studying for the A+, anything else like that, you probably don't know what RAID even means. So essentially RAID, at a very high level, it's a high performance and or, depending on the RAID level, it's a high availability, aka that backup of volumes, and it's somewhat advanced, won't be really covered for the scope of this course. I really encourage, if you're wanting to learn more about RAID, start checking out CompTIA A+. Now, before we go too far away from it, you know we love to go into the documentation here. So we're going to go over to the browser, and we're going to talk about the encrypt Mac data with FileVault. So in this, again, you can specifically see the user guides. These are going to tell you the full in-depth, what exactly you need to do, and overall, one key emphasis, if you turn on FileVault and you have other users, the other user's information is also encrypted. Now this also differs. You can choose from Ventura 13, Monterey 12, Big Sur 11, Catalina 10.15, Mojave 10.14, and High Sierra. Because, again, Apple doesn't support any of the other operating systems anymore because they've been at end of life. So, always, if you're doing a feature like disk encryption, have the documentation pulled up on the side and ensure that you're following the documentation, be it for FileVault or BitLocker, how we're going to talk about, and keep yourself safe. Let's go back to the slideshow here, and we're going to go ahead and move on. So, one quick note before we go further. This is from, again, another screenshot I was able to find, but FileVault disk encryption. We're not going to be doing this in a demo. We don't have a VM of an Apple device, but we do want to emphasize the capability on this, right? That this is typically how the setup, the beginning page, so on and so forth, of FileVault disk encryption will be. You can see that there's two checkboxes that you have available for you. You can go ahead and turn on FileVault disk encryption, or you can also say allow any iCloud account to allow my iCloud account to unlock my disk, right? If it was any, that would be concerning. But this is the first page that you'll typically see from setting up File Vault. Let's go ahead and move on, and now let's start talking about Windows OS. So now that we've covered the Mac OS, let's talk a little bit about the Windows operating systems, right? So one key thing that I need to make clear is that whenever we're talking about Windows operating system disk encryption, we're specifically talking about BitLocker, right? With BitLocker, it's not something that's available for any of the standard versions of Windows 10 or 11. It's only really available and sold for Windows Pro. Windows Pro, Enterprise, or Education editions. It's also available for any server, 2008 and onwards, and it is available for Pro and Enterprise versions of 8 and 8.1. And really, BitLocker is an idea of protecting a device if it was lost or stolen. Remember, laptops generally weren't that popular on Windows OS, let alone any OS at the time whenever BitLocker was introduced at 2007, right? Apple was still dominating the laptop system. If you were using a laptop and you needed it so badly, you typically used a Linux-based distribution. It was a very niche use case, and typically people were saying, well, we'll use tablets instead, which ran off of Android. Generally speaking, though, it goes ahead and conducts a full encryption of the volume, meaning that it encrypts the full disk, or that use space encryption. BitLocker typically, though, does go ahead and be associated with full disk encryption. As mentioned, it does, though, give the option for use space encryption only to really, and again, optimize the speed of their deployments for new volumes. And really the idea with BitLocker, well, it was originally actually being developed in 2004. And it took until 2007 to get off the ground with it. So remember, a lot of these features we're talking about, although it has been almost 20 years now, that's relatively young for talking about the technology advancements and the software advancements at that. BitLocker was released to the public in 2007, and the idea originally was to ensure that the Windows boot and system files had their integrity ensured, making sure it wasn't being tampered with or changed or anything like that, right? Again, if you're a security nerd, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Now, BitLocker is extremely powerful with this acronym TPM, and that basically means this Trusted Platform Module. They tend to play really nice together, and because BitLocker can validate that the boot and the system files are accurate, prohibiting the access if not, and with TPM, it's one of the newer modules that must be used for Windows 11 to help increase against firmware-based attacks. So that's basically the software that's running on the hardware there. And much like disk encryption, TPM leverages those cryptographic keys. So again, if you're a math nerd, start looking into cryptography there, because it's a huge in-demand field right now. And that also is more focused on crypto processing for TPM there. One thing again, it's still not a one-size-fits-all, it's 100% secure, you're golden, right? No solution in security will ever be foolproof, and the idea of defense in depth has to be followed. One great example, in 2017, BitLocker was able to be bypassed using a TPM chip that had exposed public keys to private keys. Basically, again, outside of the scope of this course, but to give it a high-level point of view, something that it wasn't supposed to ever share was shared. But, keeping defense in depth again. One other key point, we talked a little bit about RAID with Mac OS, right? Where File Vault is not compatible with RAID. Well, with BitLocker, it is, but not dynamic disks. So, if you're running any RAID setups there on your disks, make sure that you're looking into this before you go ahead and apply BitLocker. Now, what does that kind of look like? We're going to talk a little bit about BitLocker recovery. So in this demo, not in this demo, but in this picture, you can see how BitLocker recovery tends to be. Again, your number keys, you just go ahead and enter that in, enter the recovery key for this drive. once you go ahead and do it, you can go ahead and access that drive if you need to. So on that, let's move on to the demo. All right, so we're going to be actually demoing how BitLocker looks and how it's set up on a Windows OS device here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go into our VM here. So again, I'm going to open up my VM and hope I remember this password here. Word. All right. And we'll go ahead and let that load on up. All right, and we can see that it loaded. Again, Windows license will expire soon. No big deal. So we're going to go ahead and get right to the point of it with BitLocker. So on the virtual machine, we're going to go ahead and navigate to Manage BitLocker. One of the ways I'm going to do that is just going to the search menu, Manage BitLocker. Cool story. And now, key reason we're able to do this, folks. Look right down here, Windows 10 Enterprise Evaluation. We're evaluating an enterprise-based license. So, we do have BitLocker pulled up here, but I do want to show you a separate way to go ahead and get here. So I'm going to open up the File Explorer and go to this PC. And from what I'm going to do is right-click on local drive and do turn on BitLocker, right? These are both opportunities and ways to enable BitLocker. There isn't one way that's better than the other. It's just really your preference at that point. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run it from the File Explorer, right? So let's just run that and checking your PC's configuration. And it's going to tell us, how do you want to back up your recovery key? In this case, we're not going to actually do it. We're just going to cancel out and show you the other way as well. So close out of that. And now what we're going to do, I'm going to turn this off. That's the first thing. Turn off the volume. And I'm going to go back to this BitLocker drive encryption. Remember, we got here from Manage BitLocker, right? Again, though, we're going to click on Turn on BitLocker. And guess what? It's going to be the same exact stuff. Now, for the purposes of the demo, we don't have a Microsoft account, so we're not going to save it to the Microsoft account. Personally, if we did, I would probably go ahead and use that Microsoft account. But, again, purposes of demo. What we're going to do instead is we're going to click on Print the Recovery Key. And we're going to do Microsoft Print to PDF, basically converting it to a PDF, no big deal. And typically what you would want to do, right, you would want to put this on a place that is not on the volume. For the purposes of this demo, we're going to actually place it on the volume, but in a real-world environment, you would want to be printing this out maybe on a physical piece of paper, maybe on a different volume, maybe on your OneDrive, whatever else it may be. But for the purposes of this, we're going to just go ahead and put this. So demo key. So we're printing it, and we can see it populated here. Now again, purposes of demo, I'll open it up. This is typically what it looks like. So identifier, recovery key, it'll give you that information. Do not show again. Yeah. So we'll close this out and we'll click on next. Now you can see that that next button is now available for me to click on, whereas previously it wasn't. So we'll click on next, and it's going to then give us these options. Hey, do we want to do use disk space only, or do we want to do the entire disk? I'm going to go ahead and do the entire drive here. You can see slower, but best for PCs and drives already in use. Because this is a demo one, we don't really have a lot in use. So it should be basically the same time. I'm going to click on next, and then it gives us this option, choose which encryption method to use. This is where that cryptography comes into play. Personally, I always say new encryption mode, but there are niche use cases where you have to go ahead and say compatibility. So we'll do new, and then it's going to say, are you ready to encrypt this drive? One thing that I love that BitLocker does, run BitLocker system check, making sure that BitLocker can read the recovery key and encryption keys before encrypting it. I always love whenever software gives us this capability to say, hey, does this make sense? So we're going to go ahead, check that, and then click on continue. As you can see, the check might take a while, but it is recommended to ensure that you selected unlock method works without requiring the recovery key. Cool story. So we'll click on continue from here. And so from here, you can see that it's going to start encrypting our C drive. I'm going to go ahead and let this finish out. It's going to take a little bit, so I'm going to pause the recording and we'll come back once it's finalized. All right, so we have now returned and we can see that the encryption of C is now complete. This is awesome. We are now encrypted. If we go ahead and come on over here, we can see that on the File Explorer, we have a little lock now. So if we wanted to, we can go back here, right-click on it, Manage BitLocker, and right away we can suspend the protection, which basically pauses it, turns it off temporarily. We can back up the recovery key. Maybe we want to do a different method, or we can turn off BitLocker. Because of the sake of this, we're going to go ahead and just turn off BitLocker, right? We'll do turn off BitLocker. Your drive will be decrypted. Basically, Microsoft saying, you sure about that? But we're in good shape here. So we're going to turn it off. And BitLocker decrypting, decryption in progress. It's going to take a few moments here, but as you can see, it's going to proceed to do the same exact thing. Now, again, for the purposes of the demo, we always want to clean up after ourselves. I would encourage that for the same with the lab, based on the instructions there, but you know, I would always say clean up after yourself. So I'm going to pause this again, let it run, and show you the message whenever it's decrypted. All right, so we now have had the decryption of the C drive completed. So again, we're closing this out, going back to it, and we can see that lock is no longer there. If we right-click, guess what? Turn on BitLocker. If we go back here, guess what? It says BitLocker is turned off. So if we go ahead and just close all this out, it will go ahead and essentially be useless to have this demo key, so we're going to delete that. But overall, we were able to see the process of how we decrypted and re-encrypted a drive. Let's go ahead and return back to the slideshow here. So now with the slideshow, we've now done the demo. We understand how BitLocker works, how to turn it on, turn it off, and what parameters we likely need to do. We saw that it was pretty easy to go ahead and turn on BitLocker and turn it off. However, again, remember, where we get in trouble is whenever we don't have that recovery key in a very well secured and very well situated location. So overall in this lecture, right, we learned about those Windows settings for BitLocker. We learned how to apply the settings. We learned the differences of full disk and used disk encryption as well. So what we're going to give you is, again, this at-home lab. Main disclosures. Again, remember, don't conduct these labs on your personal computer. Use VirtualBox for this. And the environment is preset with the OVA file. You can do whichever environment you want to, but that OVA file is going to go ahead and have that preset environment for you. And again, as part of the series, right, this is a at-home, get hands-on, be able to experience what's going on in this topic. So in this lab, you are going to be tasked with preparing for an interview as an endpoint administrator, and you want to brush up on your disk encryption knowledge. You take a small self-guided quiz to prepare and proceed. Additionally, and this is where it's important, remember, measurement of success, you spin up a virtual machine and you want to ensure you understand how to enable BitLocker at a minimum here. So remember, you want to be able to enable BitLocker. Some key disclosures again, you know, please complete lab 1, 2, and 3 for this, for the hands-on experience. Make sure that you have your VirtualBox up to date. And again, unfortunately, please remember, myself and the administrative team of Alphagrad do not take any responsibility for supporting your machine or troubleshooting VirtualBox. You know, we're active in Discord and want to help out, but we can't take that responsibility at a wide scale for going ahead and supporting this. As for anything, comments, questions, or observations, you know, please definitely use the Alphagrad Discord here. I'm pretty active in it. The admin team is pretty active in it. So please make sure, if you have any questions about this content, right, just ping me. Ping the admin team, right? We want to be able to talk it through, even if it's a concern about what was talked about here. So please definitely use Discord here, and you know, making sure to participate in that community as best as possible. For the upcoming session, this is going to be the final session, by the way. We are now literally approaching the end. In this upcoming session, we're going to go over the essential network security. We're going to do a recap for Windows and Mac OS and why we would use this information. So again, folks, thank you so much for tuning in. Really appreciate the time, and have fun out there. If there's any questions, definitely just ping me on Discord and everything like that, or ping the Alphagrad administration team. Thank you so much, and take care. Bye-bye.